What is up, ladies and gents? It's your boy Jermaine Event, main on MMA, and today, ladies and gents, we are checking out a video from ITP MMA Live about the curious case of Calvin Kattar's collapse, ladies and gents. What happened to Calvin Kattar? We saw him on the rise quite a bit. You know, it's a typical story with a lot of contenders. We see them rising, and then they get so far. And then once they reach that upper echelon of the division, we see that maybe they weren't at that level. You know what I'm saying? We've seen it time and time again, and it just turned out to be that Calvin Kattar didn't seem to be on that level. He made Max Holloway feel like he was the best boxer in the UFC, but I think Ilia Topuria showed that boy what's boss. But let's let's see what Calvin Kattar, or let's see what ITP has to say about our boy Calvin Kattar.
A really boring decision to Yusuf Zalal this past weekend, and I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that Kattar is now 7-7 in the UFC. This guy, who a lot of people, including myself, thought was going to be a featherweight contender for a good long while, is currently riding a 4-fight losing streak, and I kind of worry that he's at risk of being cut from the promotion. But the weird thing is, Calvin's one of those fighters whose record at face value doesn't really tell the whole story of the situation, and I'll explain what I mean by all this and more throughout this video. But first, let's talk about his fight with Yusuf really quickly. Yes, guys, I agree that Zalal fought one of the most low-risk performances I've seen in a while and backpedaled all 3 rounds. It was incredibly frustrating to watch, especially if you watched his fights from last year. In 2024, Zalal went 3-0 and won all his fights by submission and won a Performance of the Night bonus in 2 of those matches. I was really high on Yusuf heading into this fight, but good god, the way that he fought makes it really hard to be happy with his performance. Honestly, there were multiple times throughout this fight where it genuinely felt like he was running away and avoiding engagements at all costs. But you know what? Even though Zalal fought like a major weenie, it was still enough to highlight where Calvin is.
I didn't watch that fight.
Kattar looked slow, he looked timid, and once again, he didn't show any additional wrinkles to his game other than his boxing.
Yeah, he looks really slow.
At the end of the day, if a fighter is having success backpedaling, as lame as it is,
either Calvin was really slow in there, or Yusuf is like the one. Like, he's Neo, my nigga. He was dodging everything from close distance. He's throwing kicks, elbows, and he knew he was perfect defense in there. Yusuf looked amazing.
It really is the responsibility of his opponent to be able to counter it.
Why don't you just stop me from moving? Why don't you just stop the angles? Why don't you just hit me? You know what I mean? It's not that hard. Like, everybody can do it. Like, I posted like a story about my stuff, and they're like, oh my God, you're the most boring fighter. I hope you get caught. I hope this, I hope that, I hope this. I'm like, okay. I was like, you guys go fight Kattar and make him miss that much. One, I don't think you will ever make him miss that much. Nobody ever done that to him besides me. So I'm like...
Much like when a fighter holds up another fighter against the cage, such as Mario Bautista versus Jose Aldo, it is a legitimate strategy with MMA's current rule set. And until we start implementing stalling penalties, which I really think we should, then the onus is on Calvin Kattar or Jose Aldo to counter their opponent's boring-ass game plan. I don't like that this is the truth, but it's the truth. And in the very curious case of Calvin Kattar, this guy has been such a one-trick pony throughout his entire UFC career, where it feels like he's been stuck at the same level for a while now. Sure, his boxing is some of the most fun to watch when he can get it flowing, but honestly, the last time that we've seen him let his hands fly was over 3 years ago against Giga Chikadze, which was the last time that he won a UFC fight, by the way. And I say this as someone who genuinely likes the guy and respects the hell out of his skill set, but man...
Yo, when he beat Giga, like, I thought he was on this decline before that Giga fight. I think that was when Giga was like going wild on Twitter, cursing out Volkanovski. He's crazy online. And then he fought Calvin Kattar and got his fucking ass beat. He like slipped on the octagon. It was COVID times. A lot of fighters were complaining about the slippery mats because they were spraying them down in between fights. And yeah, Calvin beat that ass, but...
And his UFC career has been an emotional roller coaster full of massive highs and brutal lows, and I'll break down what I mean by this now. Kattar made his UFC debut back in 2017 at UFC 214. He was brought in on a short notice fight to fight Andre Fili, and given the circumstances, Fili was a massive betting favorite in this one. But Kattar ended up surprising everyone by putting on a super clean boxing display and picking up a unanimous decision win. After that, he took on Shane Burgos at UFC 220 in what turned out to be an absolute banger of a fight. This was one of those classic classic back and forth wars where both guys were just trading bombs, but in the third round, Kattar caught Burgos with a nasty uppercut and put him away with follow-up shots. He picked up a performance of the night bonus, and after this fight, people really started to hype him up as a dark horse in the division. But unfortunately for Kattar, his momentum came to an end when he ran into Renato Moicano at UFC 223. Moicano was just a step ahead of him for most of the fight, picking him apart with leg kicks while keeping Calvin at distance. Kattar just couldn't get into a rhythm, and he ended up losing a...
Moicano outstruck him? I would think he would have dominated him with the grappling, but that's interesting.
Pretty clear unanimous decision. It was one of those fights that made you realize that while Kattar's boxing was probably elite, he still had some holes in his game when it came to dealing with diverse strikers who could keep him at bay. And in a weird way, I feel like his fight with Zalal reminds me a bit of his fight against Moicano. In both fights, you can see what Calvin was trying to do, or at least wanted to do, but he just didn't have the speed and the tools to pull it off. But to be fair to Kattar, this really isn't a loss that he should feel all that embarrassed over, seeing as he was still so new to the UFC, and honestly, this loss has aged pretty damn well since. Anyways, Calvin rebounded from his first UFC loss in a big way by knocking out Chris Fishgold in October 2018 and then Ricardo Lamas in June 2019, with both fights ending in the first round. At this point, it felt like Kattar had something figured out. He was putting guys away early, his confidence was through the roof, and I personally remember thinking that he could actually break into the top 5. But then came his fight against Zabit. This was a big opportunity for Kattar to break into title contention, and at the time, Zabit was seen as a future champion who had never lost a fight and was making pretty easy work of all of his opponents. Moreover, this fight was pretty unique in that it was a 3-round main event, which is kind of weird because most main events are 5.
I don't know if back in the day they were doing that for fight nights. I think the fight night main events were sometimes 3 rounds. It was only recently, maybe a few years back, when they started doing the 5 rounds, and I was happy about that.
Rounds. And in hindsight, I really think the 3-round limit was what cost Calvin the win. Zabit clearly won the first 2 rounds, but in the 3rd round, Kattar started to take over. He was landing clean shots, pushing the pace, and you could tell that if this had been a 5-round fight, he might have been able to put Zabit away. But because it was only 3 rounds, Kattar lost the unanimous decision. Don't get me wrong, I was all aboard the Zabit hype train at this point in time. I'm still devastated that he quit MMA when he did, but Zabit just wasn't able to dominate Calvin the way that I thought he would. And looking back at it, if Kattar had 10 more minutes to work, this really could have been his ticket to the top of the division. Fortunately for Kattar, he was able to bounce back from the loss when he knocked out Jeremy Stephens with one of the cleanest and most brutal standing elbows in UFC history. Then he was given a main event fight against everyone's favorite gatekeeper, Danny Ige, where he pieced him up to win a unanimous decision. Oh Jesus, we've now reached his fight with Max Holloway. This was supposed to be Kattar's moment to prove that he belonged among the elite, but instead he got absolutely dismantled. Dismantled isn't even the right word for this fight. Kattar was generationally destroyed. Holloway put on what is considered one of the best striking performances in UFC history. He landed over 400 significant strikes, broke multiple records, and just made Kattar look like he didn't belong in there. And look, I give Kattar all the credit in the world for his toughness. A lot of guys would have folded under that kind of pressure, but Kattar hung in there and made it to the final bell. A lot of people thought Kattar should take a long break after that fight, and to his credit, he did. He took a year off, and when he came back, he fought Giga Chikadze in another main event. I remember picking against Calvin in this fight, given the fact that he was nearly murdered on camera by Max, as well as the hype surrounding Chikadze back then. But Calvin proved me wrong in a big way by beating the brakes off of Giga. Calvin showed that he still had that dog in him by beating Giga from pillar to post to win a dominant unanimous decision. But as has been the theme with Kattar's career, the highs were followed by more lows. He fought Josh Emmett, and this was a pretty close fight. A lot of people, myself included, thought Kattar did enough to win, but the judges gave it to Emmett by split decision.
I want to go back and watch that again.
I agree with all the people that say that Kattar deserved the win, but at the same time, I can't even be mad at the result of this fight because Calvin just didn't fight a good fight. He followed up one of the greatest rebound performances.
I feel like if I remember that fight correctly, I felt like Kattar won that fight because this is when I was able to watch like every fight.
Over Chikadze, where he showed aggression and killer instinct with a really flat performance against Emmett. Calvin was for sure the better fighter between the two that night, but he didn't do a good job at showing it. I think he showed way too much respect for Emmett's power, and thus he didn't let his hands go as much as he should have, and ultimately that's what cost him the judge's decision. Again, I don't agree with the result of this fight, but that doesn't mean that Kattar didn't have a disappointing performance. Then came the Arnold Allen fight, and this is where things really took a turn for the worse. After losing the first round, Kattar blew out his knee in the second, and the fight was stopped. Obviously, this was a really sad way to lose, especially when you consider the momentum he had built back up with the Giga win. And of course, knee injuries such as this can change the trajectory of an athlete's career for the worse, and I'm not gonna lie, I do think that we can see the effects of Calvin blowing out his knee all the way up to now. Kattar made his return to competition at UFC 300 against former bantamweight champion Jermaine Sterling. And even though there was no doubt about what Aljo's game plan was going to be heading into this fight, Calvin just didn't have any answer to Sterling's wrestling. And sure, it's not like he ever showed that he had high-level takedown defense, seeing as the UFC had only matched him up against other strikers throughout his career, but Kattar was tossed around like a ragdoll. And of course, that brings us to the present day, where Calvin just lost a fight by not being able to catch Youssef Zalal. You know, it's funny, I was one of those fans that was hoping, wishing, and honestly believing that Kattar could be a top contender at 145 for a while. I mean, let's be real here, there was never much of a chance that he was ever going to be champion while Max Holloway or Alexander Volkanovski held the belt, but I seriously did think that Calvin was going to be a top 5 guy for an extended period of time. And looking back at it, I do think that I got fooled by his flashy boxing and exciting finishes a bit too much. For as good of a boxer as he is for MMA standards, that's kind of all he is. But to be fair, his boxing did take him pretty damn far in the sport, but he never developed the necessary skills to supplement his game if his boxing failed him, much like in the Max Holloway fight. We barely ever see him throw kicks or go for takedowns or initiate the clinch, and in a sport like MMA, that's only ever going to get you so far. But at the same time, even though this guy's 7-7 in the UFC, I do feel like I hold his career in higher regard than a lot of other fighters who have slightly better records than him. Because for one, he does have some really good finishes that made for some great highlight moments, and also some of his losses have a little bit more nuance to them than most other fighters. He fought Renato Moicano in his 3rd UFC fight, and Moicano's gone on to have a really good career. If his fight against Zabit was 5 rounds, then I think he would have been able to get the win. I personally feel like he won against Josh Emmett, and even though he was losing against Arnold Allen, who knows what would have happened if he didn't blow out his knee. This is kind of what I mean when I say that this is the curious case of Calvin Kattar. He has shown flashes of genuine brilliance that convinced many people that he had what it took to be a top dog, but time and time again, he fell short when the stakes were at its highest. And now that he's 36 years old and has seemed to lost whatever athletic ability he did have, it seems like Calvin's going to be known as one of those guys whose careers came up shorter than fans expected it to. Because for a guy who fans were saying had the potential to be fighting for a title one day, his best win is either against Jeremy Stephens or Giga Chikadze. Let that sink in. Anyways, that's the video for today. Let me know what you think about Calvin Kattar's career. Do you think that he can still make a run at the top, or do you think his best days are behind him? As always, if you like the video, then like the video, and if you
Damn, that's crazy. When he puts it like that, yeah, I think his best days are behind him. His best wins are either Giga Chikadze or Jeremy Stephens, the hardest hitting 145, or which I think that's a dope win. That's today that win has aged pretty well, given the hype that Stephens has from bare knuckle and beating Eddie Alvarez a few weeks ago, a month ago, something like that. Not that long ago, I would say. Not that long ago. But man, it's crazy. Yeah, I wasn't super high on Kattar, but I thought like he could at least challenge for the belt at some point. All right. I thought he would have challenged for the belt way before there was ever like a Arnold Allen's and all these people, or Ilya Taporia. You know what I'm saying? I thought Calvin Kattar would have been a contender a long time ago, but it just never seemed to happen. And I personally don't think it's going to happen. I think we're seeing the end of the road for Calvin Kattar in the UFC. But let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with me, or do you feel like Calvin Kattar does have some gas left in the tank? Ladies and gents, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Head on over to ITP MMA Live. Give them a like, give them subscribe. Thank you guys for being here once again. Hit that like, hit that subscribe, and I will see you guys when I see you guys. I'll holla.